So thank you and welcome. Professor Mohammed, you can start.
Thank you very, very much. This is Mohammed Abu Nimr. I am Professor of Peace and Conflict Resolution at the American University in Washington, D.C., as well as Senior Advisor at the CICID, International Center for Intercultural and Interreligious Dialogue. It is with a great pleasure that we open this session and important one that deals with inclusive education for migrant and children as well. Inclusivity in education, of course, is a crucial aspect of our both prevention and responding to crisis and conflict. But before we delve into the theme, obviously this is organized by Arigato International with the support and leadership of partner organizations who bring together extensive experience and focusing mainly on the promotion of inclusive education for migrants and refugees. The panel itself for the session is sponsored by CICID, the Center for Intercultural and Interreligious Dialogue, as well as by the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, which has an ambitious commitment for the realization of the right to education for crisis-affected and displaced children and youth as well. The hub itself was launched in January this year and counts 24 members committed to realize this aspect. And obviously, putting a panel like this or an event like this in this week requires lots of work. So thanks to the co-sponsor, the speakers, and their institution organization, as well as their government whose support made this happen. And obviously the appreciations for all of you who participated, including the different permanent missions who distributed and invited their stakeholders as well. I'm hoping as a moderator to say very few, the least words here, and really the main objective is to try and explore some lessons learned and some success story, concrete example that we'll hear from a combination of experts, policymakers, as well as people of different, both religious and national and ethnic background. Probably the best thing is to start with Dr. Fadi Yarak, who represent on this one is somebody from the Ministry of Education, and he's the Director General of Education and Higher Education in Lebanon, and he's a colleague and a friend we've met several times. Dr. Fadi, thank you for giving us the time to do the opening remark and the framing of this panel. The floor is yours, and after that we'll move to the speakers in the order as we agreed upon. Thank you. Please, Dr. Fadi Yarak, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone who's with us today. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. It's a pleasure to see you even from far. I'd like to thank the Arigato Foundation, International Foundation in Geneva and in Tokyo. I'd like to thank CICID for their support for this session and all the supporters and the organizers. Welcome everyone today, and it's very important to this very important session about inclusive education for migrants and refugees. As you know, the number of migrant and refugee school-age children around the world today has grown by 26% since the year 2000 and could fill 500,000 classrooms now. This is becoming an important number, and our duty as practitioners, as scholars, as governments, NGOs, and people who are committed to the causes of children is to work to give fair education, to access, to quality, and to ensure that every child who's a migrant or his migrant or refugee had the right to access this kind of education. Well, I highly would like to talk about a few elements about these children who should have a real access, but not only access in a formal education, but also to provide them with alternative pathways for all children, pathways of education. These alternative pathways should be flexible. We should move from the non-formal education talking to a different pathways where every child has the opportunity to learn and to continue in his life or her life. Stability is very important. Migrants and refugees have a high rate of mobility. Therefore, we should make that they receive the adequate and continuous education. And at least we give them the physical and the spiritual and the emotional stability to continue in their learning journey during a year or a period of time during their learning. Definitely, it is very important within the access, within the education, to preserve and to preserve and expose them to the cultural background, to preserve the cultural identity of these children, to ensure that they understand their origin and their roots and traditions. This is very important. And it's not anymore just talking about literacy and numeracy. We need to talk when we access and we give the opportunity to these children to have more than the literacy and numeracy, the socio-emotional learning, the spiritual learning when it's needed, the ethics learning when it's needed. And this is very important. Our duty and work should be concentrating on a comprehensive accessibility to education. We should think more and more about their vulnerability, and we should give an equity and mainly gender equality. Vulnerability is very important. And in the case of tackling them, not only the status of the children, not based on the refugees or race or anything. Any child is moving, any child in a vulnerable situation, we should give him and include him or her in education. And this is very important to provide the right policies for this equity in the accessibility. Protection is an important element. I'm sure that we will hear today from our speakers about these dimensions. Protection, it is very important. We need to broad that the classroom, that the learning center, it's a safe, protective, and healthy environment. And all this for these children. Resilience. I think we lived, and COVID had a big impact on the refugees because they are vulnerable children. And this is very important to think about how to provide in terms of COVID, of different ways of education. And this way we are talking again, not only on the physical accessibility, all kinds of accessibility. So it's very important to mobilize resources for refugees. And it is very urgent at a time when they are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, to their situation, and that's important to face this situation. I'm coming from Lebanon, and Lebanon is living on a different situation. We are in high difficult situation. We have multi-layers of crisis, from the corona to the Beirut blast, to the financial and economic situation, to the highest capita per world of children, refugees and displaced. We have the same number of nationals with refugees, and we are living the protracted crisis of Syria since 2011. For all this, we need to think about how to protect their right to education. We thought about how to include these groups to the national education system. and how to tailor programs that for their needs, and to prepare the teachers to deal with different needs and to address the diversity and the hardship of the refugees. And this is important. It's very important. I highly recommend and to think with donors, with a specialized agency, to open to the private sector also. It's very important to increase the support for both teaching and administrative staff through pre and in-service training for the staff, and to develop the skills how to work with the children in this comprehensive methodology, and also to ensure the right financing for the refugee in education. Education in emergency and the refugees, as we said in the beginning, it is an increasing number. So we need to think, all of us, how to address specifically their need with the right resources. I really thank again all the speakers for what they will be giving us today. Thank the organizer. Thank you, Arigato Foundation and Kaisid for this important event. The children's rights, it's a commitment of all of us, and it's an important platform today on this side event to remind everyone about our duty of such commitment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fadi, in framing the issues, in particular the 3 points regarding the COVID threat, as well as the issue of accessibility and protection, as I think 3 key points that I'm sure we'll come back to them through the different speakers, through their remarks, and hoping also to have some concrete examples, and also for reminding us with the severe situation and that facing Lebanese in general during this time. Thank you again. Without further ado, let's go to our first speaker, Afshan Khan from UNICEF, Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia and Special Coordinator for the Refugees and Migrant Response in Europe. So thank you for Afshan for agreeing to speak here. You have your 7 minutes, and would appreciate I'll give you probably 2 minutes notice before you allow you to conclude your talk. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Maria Lucia Uribe and Arigato International for organizing this side event. And thank you, Dr. Fadi Yarak, for your inspirational opening remarks. As has been said already, education is key for economic, social, and cultural integration for refugees and migrants in host communities. And ultimately, at UNICEF, we believe it's the most important investment for a better life. UNICEF is also noting with concern how intolerance, xenophobia, discrimination, and racism are on the rise in Europe and Central Asia, and how it is threatening social cohesion and impeding young girls and boys' lives in order to both learn and thrive. So when we look at what type of support do countries need in order to ensure inclusive education for migrants and refugees in Europe and Central Asia, there's a few key points I'd like to emphasize. One, upholding support and political commitment through a normative dialogue. So upholding commitments to human rights and humanitarian law by member states is fundamental to ensure inclusive education for migrant and refugee children. The UN is both a marketplace of member states and as a global organization at the service of humanity, plays important roles in protecting the normative framework intended to shield those who are vulnerable. And Dr. Fadi spoke very eloquently about the vulnerabilities. So the 47th session of the Human Rights Council work includes looking at government performance and upholding commitments to the conventions. And the executive director of UNICEF, Henrietta Fore, has also called on governments to provide child refugees with the same care, services, dignity, and protection as all other children. And with UNICEF's mandate to safeguard the rights of all children everywhere in all situations, we see some key elements in order to strengthen systems to build resilience for inclusive education. So first, legislation and education policies that come from a rights perspective, that are guided by gender equality, non-discrimination, and the best interest of child's ability and a country's commitment to ensure that inclusive education is available for refugee and migrant children. And that inclusive education is the full spectrum of education, from early childhood development to tertiary education, because it's clearly the main vehicle for transitioning from humanitarian to development, and for those who are ultimately granted asylum to integrate them into the host community. It requires both system strengthening and capacity development. And as member states have signed a global compact for refugees, it gives us an opportunity to work with them to enhance the quality and inclusiveness of national education systems for boys and girls from refugee and host community. By way of example, Turkey is hosting 3.6 million Syrian refugees, of whom approximately 40% are in school-age cohorts. UNICEF has supported the Turkish government through the journey of the humanitarian development continuum, which has resulted in a process of transition of all Syrian children into Turkish medium schools. The temporary learning centers that were set up from 2014 due to the Syria crisis are now being converted to Turkish public schools and are being used to facilitate a Turkish language program to enable the transition of students into regular public schools. I think the other element that's critical are adequate resources and financing. And again, Dr. Fadi spoke to this, but countries need financial resources to implement equitable and quality education. There's a growing consensus that resources for services and capacity development that both refugee and host communities need bring both sustainable results and social cohesion. So in order to implement inclusive education for migrants and refugees, there is a need for more predictable multi-year funding. Again, a practical example, Uganda is hosting the largest refugee community in Africa. UNICEF has supported the government of Uganda to ensure that the education of refugee plan is part of a sustainable integrated approach, which in turn is closely aligned with the education sector plan for the country with a costed budget. Now, responding to inclusive education for refugees and migrants is a collective effort. In the spirit of UN reform, UNICEF, UNHCR, and UNESCO are all working closely together, side by side, with civil society, faith-based organizations, and communities for inclusive education for refugees and migrants. Inclusive quality learning for refugee and migrant children also needs a whole of government approach that includes intersectoral collaboration, for example, between those responsible for education, health, social affairs, and migration. And this is really important during the time of COVID as well.
You have only 1 minute, sorry.
So, thank you. So this comprehensive approach also applies to the local context and the whole of school. I'll close by saying that in terms of creative and innovative solutions, when it comes to specific barriers for refugees' children's learning, their language barriers, psychosocial needs and traumas, addressing learning losses for children who are migrating across countries. So we have new tools like the digital learning passport that will help reimagine education. And then learning to live together programs are extremely useful for addressing barriers between refugee and host communities in crisis settings. And that's where we believe the civil society, religious communities, students themselves, peers and classmates of refugee children will be very important to ensure that this social cohesion comes about. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And I turn it back to you, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you, Afshan, for providing us with examples from Turkey as well, Uganda, and also mentioning several concrete tools, especially living together, that UNICEF is deploying and using to respond to some of these crises. Thank you. We now can move to Angeliki Aroni, head of the Unit of Integration and Support in the Special Secretariat for the Protection of Unaccompanied Minors, Ministry of Migration and Asylum, from Greece, with extensive experience in this area. And I want to remind everyone, encourage you to use the chat in order to make your points and engage each other, as well as introduce yourself to the remaining participants. Thank you. Angeliki, the floor is yours with the 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with well-esteemed colleagues. And having set the context of refugee and migrant education, I will give you the response that Greece had. And we will talk about specific examples, practices, policies, and challenges that we faced. Let's start with what was there before refugees arrived. Like in most of the countries, there were policies and practices already for migrants. In Greece, more specifically, we have schools of intercultural education where special programs are applied. Usually, immigrants, when they first come to Greece, they enroll in one of these schools. And I think one of the most important elements for the schools was the fact that teachers are selected based on their knowledge on intercultural education. So we have teachers with special qualifications. The second practice and policy that we had and we still have for immigrants is the educational priority zones, geographical zones, where social and economic barriers prevent the access and the achievement of students. Usually all immigrants lived in these geographical priority zones. And what we do is we have reception classes, and students are taught Greek as a second language for 15 hours, and the rest of the school subjects with their Greek classmates. But why weren't these policies enough? Next slide, please. When we had the refugee influx back in 2016, there were some new facts that differentiated refugee children from migrant children. First of all, we had about 30,000 school-age children, migrant children, residing in Greece, and we had the mandate to integrate all of them. The second one was that we had a new unfamiliar profile, because most of the children escaped wars, armed conflicts, and this had an implication in both their educational and psychosocial needs. Refugee children do not have the same needs, do not have the same characteristics with the migrant children that we have had so far. Many children were and still are illiterate. They have very little schooling, and many of them have a long absence from the school environment. We have a constant flow, whether internal or external. You understand how this creates a problem to the schools and to the educational system. We had limited or non-existent prior academic records to base and place these students accordingly. And last but not least, you have already started the discussion in chat. We also had very limited funding due also to the financial crisis and austerity measures that Greece was undergoing at that time. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We kept the intercultural schools, we kept the preparatory reception classes, but we also had the policy of afternoon preparatory classes solely for refugees. There are afternoon classes operating from 2 to 6. They're set up very close to where students reside. And the main aim was to facilitate, simplify the procedures for integrate them into the formal education system. Next slide, please. We have been discussed, and I heard it before, that we should provide access to education for refugees. For me, we are past this. We do not just need to ensure access to education. We need access to quality education, which also means active participation of the students and achievement potential. Please remember Tomaszewski's work on the 4A scheme. We need quality education. We need education that is available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable. Next slide, please. Additional policies. We wouldn't, like Afshan said before, we wouldn't have done it without synergies and partnerships. We wouldn't have done what we did if we did not have the support of other ministries, municipalities, international organizations like IOM, UNHCR, UNESCO, Unicef, as well as local NGOs. There are examples that we can discuss, but I don't want to take much of your time, and I know that my limit is 7 minutes, so next slide, please. Challenges. We had challenges in the educational and administrative sector. We're not a very flexible system, and the recruitment of the teachers is still on a substitute base, which means that every year we change. So experience is not capitalized. For other reasons, political reasons, we could not use qualified teachers. We were obliged to take teachers from a national archive that does not take into consideration qualifications, but rather when the teacher graduated from university. We also have, and I guess many of the member states, both in Europe, Africa, Asia, I think it's the same. There is a lack of flexibility in the administrative mechanism to effectively respond. We still have lack of an appropriate assessment system, especially for the teenagers. And due to funding reasons also, we do have insufficient teacher training when it comes to inclusive education. Next slide, please. But we also had tensions and resistance to refugee education from both educational community. Unfortunately, we did have school communities that refused or were reluctant or were resistant in enrolling refugee students. We had reactions from local communities, parents, associations that did not want our children at school, but we also had resistance from refugees themselves who consider Greece a transient country. Another thing that I would like to mention is that another big challenge is the lack of support that refugee students have from home. We have illiterate, non-Greek speaking parents that cannot support their children's schooling. And at the same time, we have children that work and act as cultural mediators between their families and the Greek community. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Angelique, if you can conclude would be great. Thank you.
Yes. Unfortunately, we have COVID to add to the challenges. Next slide, please. I'm pretty sure that many countries faced the same challenges because refugees do not have electronic devices, because refugee children do not have the appropriate network connection for online digital education. They do not have the adult support. We do not have software programs that are applicable to cell phones. We do not have offline initiatives. And a last slide that does not have to do with electronic devices. School for these children is a lot more than lessons. And when we deprive them of actually physically going to school, we deprive them of an escape from their confinement, because many of them live in refugee accommodation centers. We deprive them of the precious physical space of school and the schoolyard. We deprive them of the cultural events that they go with their schools. And at the same time, look at the pictures. These camps, these containers cannot replace school.
I'm really sorry, but it's been 10 minutes. I promise to come back to you.
That was the last one.
Thank you. Apology for my impatience, but because we do have another several speakers. Thank you again. Thank you for the policies, the member state explanation, and the valuable insight you provide from your experience. Much appreciated. And I'm sure we'll come back to you through the Q&A. Now we move to our next speaker, Mrs. Shahrazadi Fidal from the Education Specialist, UNESCO, Kenya. The floor is yours. You have 7 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being here for this important day and this side event. So I'm going to start by providing some background information on how migrant and refugees has been impacted. So as you may have known, we have the Global Monitoring Education Report, and the one of 2019 was specifically focused on migration and displacement. And the report have indicated that migration and displacement have been identified as two global challenges that hinder the achievement of SDG 4. According to this report, the number of migrant and refugee school-age children around the world has gone up by 26% since 2000. And this could fill 500,000 classrooms. Particularly, education affects not only migrants' attitudes, aspirations, and beliefs, but also those of their hosts. Increased classroom diversity brings both challenges and also opportunities to learn from each other's cultures and experiences. Appropriate education can help citizens critically process information and promote cohesive societies, and content the spread of negative, partial, and exclusive and dismissed notions of immigrants and refugees. So, as you know, from the UN, we work with the core principle to leave no one behind. A lot of commitment has been done. It's true that countries commit to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, but a lot of them continue to experience serious challenges in their quest to achieve this goal and to fulfill the international commitment to the respect to the right to education for all, included for refugees. So historically, if you can please display in show, can you please display in slideshow? Thank you. Yes, so the first screen, please. The first slide, please. The next one. Yes, so I was saying, like, historically, most governments have provided parallel education to refugees facing myriads of challenges, including lack of qualified teachers, examinations that were not certifiable, and also, of course, funding issue, facing conflicts between the host communities and refugees, including tensions between refugees coming from the same country, extending their differences and hostilities to the camps, which sometimes, escalated into violent conflicts. In order to respond to these challenges at a time of unprecedented displacement worldwide, UN and countries have worked together to commit to respect human rights of refugees and migrants. So there's a lot of international instruments has been developed, such as the Global Compact on Refugees that already has been said, and also the Refugee Response Plan at the country level in order to ensure resilience of refugees and host community to prepare better. So I want to give a perspective from East Africa. In East Africa, some governments have taken action through some regional institutions such as IGAD. So IGAD member states, namely to name them, is Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda. They have made great strides in embracing the New York Declaration and moved on the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees, both at the regional and national levels. In line with the SDG 4, and as you know, in the region, we also work with the Africa Union agenda. And really to commit towards inclusion of refugees and displaced persons into national education systems. So this is really something we really try to work hard on it and to support. So there were a lot of meetings, ministerial meetings. So this is just background information where countries committed to ensure every refugee, returnee, and host community to access quality education in self-learning environment. So a task force has been put in place to implement what we call the Djibouti Declaration, and country really started working to make this a reality. Next slide, please. So I want to give example of what has been done in Kenya and Uganda to give you concrete what is happening on the ground. So Kenya, hosts more than 500,000 refugees and asylum seekers. And Kenyan Ministry of Education, closely with partners, UNESCO, has really tried to work hard to ensure that refugees have access to secondary education in Kenya, and also to tertiary education, including technical and vocational education and training, to be able to also supply issues like socioeconomic factors, cultural norms, and traditions, many of which are shared by the communities that host refugees and asylum seekers in Kenya. So it's very specific to Kenya. The majority of refugee learners are enrolled in primary, pre-primary, and secondary, and they also follow the Kenyan national curriculum. So in Kenya, the examination they have, it's in the base, and the learning institution have been managed closely with UNHCR. We work real closely with them, and we have been able to lead an alternative system of service delivery of education. So in line with the Global Compact of Refugee, the Kenya Refugee Operation promotes the inclusion of refugee in the national system. And this is very good because it's responding to the immediate needs to the refugee and to promote transition from learning to earning. So in support of this, I'm just going to say a little bit more about what have been done with partners in collaboration with the Ministry of Education. So for example, we have worked on the national processes for the uptake of the Djibouti Declaration. We also have work on research work because it's very important to inform strategic policy advocacy. We cannot have strategic policy if we cannot do the research, if we cannot have the data. It needs to be data informed, and this is very important work. And of course, we try to develop immediate action. And as you know, there's also issue of connectivity. So we try to have offline learning initiative that enable, when you are in a remote area, when you don't have access to internet, to have, resources for teachers and learners. Next slide, please. So I'm going to.
Shahrazadi, you're in the last minute, please.
Yes. Okay, so quickly on Uganda. So as it has been said already, Uganda is the biggest refugee hosting country in Africa. So we work closely with partners, UNICEF, UNHCR, and we work with the government to develop really inclusive education, So we also have digital library. We worked on particularly on the refugee settlement in the West Nile, on conflict sensitive education. And this has really contributed to mitigate, the potential conflict within the camp. We also work on refugee teacher certification, and this is a consortium with UNICEF, Save the Children, and UNHCR, and it's within the Educate Cannot Wait. So I just want to go to the next slide so that I can conclude and share that actually the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the existing challenges, particularly for the vulnerable population, such as refugees, but also the gender disparities. And in response to this pandemic, there's a lot of opportunity that came out, particularly for the alternative of ICT in education. So I just want to say that ICT education is a technology that offers multiple solutions for inclusive education to respond to refugee and migrant education. It's effective. It can be done where there's low connectivity. It's appropriate for teacher training. Also, the use of mobile technology, there's more number of refugees that has mobile, so this can be really used. And also, I think there's something we can think about is the open educational resources that are existing and needs to be used. So I just want to say that we try to develop offline resource center to provide continued learning for learners, and this can be used easily in refugee camps. So we work off online and low-tech environments and the learners on the move. So basically, we really want to promote and to work together. We try to focus more on the solutions than the challenges, and we want to deliver as one UN, carry on working together to ensure education is a right for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again for giving us East Africa several cases as well, and giving us some really good example about how the UN agency, in this case, UNESCO, is dealing with these issues. I must say I've heard the creativity, as a title from you several times. So maybe we can come back and speak about the influence of each of those. Thank you. And allow me to move now to Afghanistan, actually, World Vision Afghanistan. Javid Natik, who is the education sector lead. Javid, you have your 7 minutes.
Good morning, good afternoon to all panel members and participants. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. I've been asked to talk on the situation of education, provision of education for internally displaced, as well as returnees and refugees in Afghanistan. So if our colleagues can share the presentation. The first question from me is about promoting inclusive education for all the IDPs and returnees in Afghanistan. I have to share and I have to provide you our experiences as an organization which supports Ministry of Education and the government for many years in overall the country. So we have followed and we have pursued the strategy of do no harm overall and better integration with host community. We have very good relation with working with FIT and community leaders, because when crisis occurs and a displacement occurs, there would be potential conflict between the displaced people as well as with the host community. That's why we have worked and got experience of working with do no harm and better integration of using and managing the shared sources between these two new communities and new people. As well, integrated approach between different sectors, between different programs have been a very good result, have been given a good result to us. For example, we have jointly worked with shelter, with livelihood, with food security, with wash and health. For example, in the displaced community, when we provided health and wash facilities, then in the other hand, in the other part, they have been volunteered to support their children's education. That's why this has been a very good approach for years in World Vision Afghanistan. Not to forget, for those children who are crisis affected or natural disaster affected, those who are displaced, they have to be supported with at least basic psychosocial support within education emergency classes, within first phase response classes, or even within the community-based classes. These are all the things we have got that we have to provide and partner organizations can consider. As overall reasons for this part, I know sphere is not somehow highly welcoming education as a life-saving issue, but based on our experiences, we have to consider education as life-saving issue that deeply avoid child protection. Early child marriage, child labor, during the first 6 or 3 months of displacement, we have many successful cases that avoided early child marriage and child labor. The children, those who have been or had been the risk of child marriage as well as recruitment by the armed military groups, to avoid them and put them in education settings. That's why we can consider still, we are highly promoting to consider education as life-saving issue. Then, as lessons learned for promoting inclusive education within the public schools, classes or classrooms or learning environment, we have to consider somehow partners are welcome to consider lessons learned where we have got during many years of operation. The first one is we have to deeply coordinate with education officials in national level and in sub-national levels, including public school management. And from other side, we have to consider high level of and deeply coordination and communication with faith leaders as well as community leaders in all stages of IND minimum standards of preparedness, response, and recovery. With having or with establishing education emergency classes, we can consider child rights and child protection, and including the basics for teacher training and class management to the new teachers, those who are with less qualification, or at least we're aiming to provide capacity to them. Another thing would be usage of local resources from among the displaced communities as well as host communities. For example, we can use their labor, we can use their
Sorry, Javid, you're in your minute and a half for you to conclude, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Professor. Okay. Then using mixed school management committees, for example, when you're establishing your SMC, the school management committees, the member would be from the displaced communities as well as the host communities for better integration, supporting proper documentation of new categories of people using official resources, for example, providing identification card, as well as other documentations. Them would be somehow avoiding from the future potential conflicts. Then the challenges we have faced during these years of operation, we have highly faced and observed child marriage cases between the displaced communities, which have been very sensitive among communities. It's not very easy to manage them. And it has been due to poverty, due to the socio-cultural barriers to the girls' education and many other things. Education calendar and lack of teaching resources have been one of the main things as well, because, for example, if it's 4 months or 3 months after start of educational year, then they are facing, for example, they have missed many part of, or at least some part of educational year. Language differences between the host community and displaced communities is another thing. Acceptance from host communities, for example, they have potential conflict due to the lack of resources, different cultures, and they have overall disagreement, and we have to manage with working with faith leaders and community leaders. And mostly lack of resources or short-term funding or programming for sustainability of the education emergency activities would be another part that highly welcomed by our international partners to support their partners and the NGOs as well as government to sustain at least our approach for supporting conflict-affected or natural disaster-affected children in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javid. I think you uniquely took us in the inside of the classroom and inside of the teaching methodologies as well. Thank you for sharing the list of the challenges, and I'm sure we'll get back to you as well in some of these issues. Thank you. Now I think we go to Maria Lucia Oraib, who is the director of the Arigato International in Geneva, and also I assume, not assume, I know that has lots of interest and points probably to share with us as one of the co-organizer and the primary person behind this event. Maria Lucia, you have your 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. And let me start by thanking all the panelists that have been speaking today, and in particular to the co-organizers, Kaiser Dialogue Center, the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, and to the the Republic of Cyprus that also joined us as co-sponsor of this event. So I have a particular question, which is what kind of education programming and policies are needed that can foster learning to live together? And I think most of the panelists have addressed this topic. I want to think of inclusive education, thinking of this overarching framework that should guide the development of education programming and policies. Dr. Yarak mentioned this. Afshan also mentioned the importance of adhering to human rights. So, and this is the Article 29 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child that provides a very comprehensive overview of the type of education that is needed. It underlines the obligations of states to provide quality education. And it states, among others, and I'm highlighting here on the slide, that education should address the development of respect for the child's parents, their cultural identity, language and values, for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country that he may originate, and civilizations of his or her own. The preparation of the child for a responsible life in free society in the spirit of understanding, friendship among peoples of ethnic, national, and religious groups, and persons of indigenous origin. So I think this is a very important framework for us and should be the framework for inclusive policies and programming. We know that the diverse causes of displacement, war, climate change, political instability, financial crisis always have the most negative impacts on the most vulnerable. Migrant and refugee children often come to host countries derooted from what gives them a sense of normalcy, often victims of violence and affected by anxiety and distress. Some of the most important needs for them to be able to thrive and strengthen their well-being relate to social, emotional, and spiritual needs that go beyond the physical ones. They needed to develop their sense of belonging, of feeling connected to others, developing their sense of self in connection to their ethnicity, religion, and family, a need to learn to cope with the separation and loss and the trauma that some of them have gone through. A very important need to feel valued and safe, that they are welcome and accepted for who they are, and that despite the many challenges they have gone through, there is meaning and purpose in their lives. Studies have shown that many refugee children are victims of discrimination and diverse forms of bullying in schools in host countries, such as teasing, social exclusion, physical violence, unfair treatment, racial insults, and intellectual belittling. We know that discrimination has been exacerbated at the community level during the pandemic, as Ms. Khan has mentioned before. So inclusive education must address the right to quality education as stated in Article 29 of the Convention, but also these very important needs of migrants and refugees, if it is to foster social cohesion in communities. For this to happen, education policies and programs should: one, include refugees and migrants in national education systems, and some of the speakers have mentioned this. A study conducted in countries where refugee students living in refugee centers attend afternoon separated classes in nearby public schools showed that they had poorer learning outcomes, faced more stigmatization, and had poorer development of language skills as a result of less interaction with local students in comparison with those from urban areas who are integrated fully into the public schools. The second point is we need to ensure, and a lot has been said about the training of teachers, that teachers are trained to provide inclusive learning environments. Teachers are not always equipped to work with refugees and migrant students and may lack the required cultural and religious understanding and specialized pedagogical approaches to prevent stigmatization and bullying, and most importantly, to foster dialogue and trust building. Teachers are at the center of inclusive refugee and migrant education. Teachers and their assistants need professional development. Pre-service and in-service training are necessary to provide opportunities to learn about social inclusion of refugees and migrants, to create safe environments in the classroom and create dialogue and opportunities for children to learn and interact with one another. There is a need also for psychosocial support and language support, and my colleagues have mentioned about this, so I'm not going to go into this, but there is also a need for a whole community approach. This has been mentioned also, but I want to re-emphasize this, that inclusive education should involve parents, caregivers, the community, faith communities, and Afshan also mentioned this, to create an environment that is conducive to mutual understanding and respect. And I think this is very important. Festivals that allow to learn about other religions, other cultures, opportunities for children to develop their own projects that can reach out to the community in collaborative efforts between migrant, refugees, and host. So these opportunities are important to create a whole community approach. More often than not, education for migrants and refugees is focused on access, but with little emphasis on quality education, as Dr. Aroni was mentioning. But also needs to address the needs of the host community to learn to live together with people of different backgrounds. The focus should not only be on education provided to refugees and migrants, but also to the community, the host community as well. This is why there is a critical need that education systems include intercultural and interfaith learning in schools, which is very often done through ethics education that fosters common values, critical thinking, collaboration between children of diverse backgrounds. And this is what Arigato International has been specialized for the last 20 years. Ethics education can create spaces that go beyond learning religion or learning comparative religion. It helps create spaces for dialogue to challenge stereotypes and prejudices. It helps moving from fear to trust. And we know from the field studies that there is a direct link between children's school success and values-based education that nurtures learning to live together and competences for children to learn to live together. An important example of collaborative work on intercultural and interreligious dialogue is the Network for Dialogue, which is an European-wide platform created by KAICIT that was established to bring faith and civil society actors together to promote the use of dialogue and develop more effective recommendations for social inclusion policies for migrants and refugees in Europe. Recently, they developed a policy brief with 7 critical recommendations to support teachers in the use of interreligious and intercultural dialogue in inclusive education for refugees and migrants. Some of those I have already mentioned, but just let me emphasize on 3. Engage families of refugees and migrant students in school activities as equal partners, co-educators, and beneficiaries. Parents often do not speak the host country language, and we know that parents' engagement is critical for children's school success. The policy recommends to recruit assistant teachers, religious teachers, and native language instructors as intercultural mediators who can break these language barriers, and Dr. Aroni mentioned this as well, encouraging teachers to actively reach out to parents, including phone calls or home visits that can create these additional benefits. The other aspect I want to mention is ensuring that intercultural learning is horizontally integrated into educational curricula, and it's not just a standalone subject. This can ensure that learning is internalized, the learning about the other and from the other is internalized, and that the long-term gains for social cohesion can remain. And the last one I want to emphasize is create fast-track qualification and accreditation programs for teachers with migrant or refugee backgrounds. Diversity needs to be reflected in teacher recruitment and advancement. Often refugees and first-generation migrants who were trained as teachers have difficulty entering the host country's educational system. Policymakers need to ensure the accreditation and recognition of their qualifications, as well as promote their recruitment. So let me just finish saying that education is not neutral. It can either promote social cohesion and positive transformations, or it can exacerbate inequities, foster negative images of the other, and create the foundations for violence and divisions. And this is the importance of inclusive education. Inclusive education can promote social cohesion reflected in a strengthened sense of belonging, friendships, and shared common values, can support economic strengthening, civic engagement, and can reduce poverty and strengthen the skills that contribute to stability and peace building in home countries. The stakes are high when inclusive education is not prioritized. The cost of inaction is much more than the investment in education, and that addresses the rights and needs of migrants and refugees. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Lucia, for a wonderful summary, as well as framing in many ways the points that were raised. And most important for me, I think you open a gate for us to speak about faith-based efforts and also the role of faith in general, and through the introduction of the ethics framework, as Arigato has promoted in different parts of the world, also through many years of work in education. So thank you again. We still have, before we go to the Q&A discussion, we have two special intervention from the audience that I want to give them 2 to 3 minutes. Mr. Michael Bays, chair of the advisory board of the integration of migrant from Cyprus, as mentioned, also one of the co-sponsors of this event. So the floor is yours, Mr. Michalis. Mr. Michalis?
Yes. Hello.
Yes,
from
please
Cyprus.
go ahead.
You can hear me, right? Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
you have 2 to 3 minutes, please.
Yes, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to very shortly present the situation in Cyprus regarding the education of migrants and refugees children. Okay, and here in Cyprus, we have a very specific policy for children with migratory background developed back in 2016 that we steadily update. And we also develop a specific 3-year action plans. And this policy considers children with migratory background. That means not only migrant children, but also children that have migrant parents. That means we target both the first and the second generation of migrants. Okay. All children have full and free access to education, to the school, regardless of their status here in Cyprus. That means that also irregular migrants, migrant children have full and free access to school, to education from day one, from the day they arrive on the island. The basic priorities in our policy consists, first of all, the training of the teachers. Okay, there is constant and continuous training of the teachers that deal daily with the children. Okay, based on an intercultural approach. Okay, and the other thing that we do is that the children, okay, join the class according to the age and follow this more or less the same curriculum with the Greek-speaking children. There are no specific classes, no reception or induction classes for the migrant children. And next to that, we also have a full array of supporting classes, especially for Greek as a second language lessons, combined also with afternoon activities, not only related to the lessons, but also other after-school activities like gymnastic or music lessons. Okay, and the final, just very shortly, the final priority for us is also to involve the parents. We have developed special parents questionnaire regarding their own background, but also the background of the child, as well as a guide for the parents as mediators in the main languages, Arabic, Georgian, Russian, Ukrainian, but also English and French. And all the material that the school produces regarding applications and all the letters that are exchanged with the parents are also translated in these main languages, because our aim is also to involve parents in these steps of integration of the child to the education. This is really very shortly a brief overview of the educational policy here in Cyprus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michalis, on this introduction or brief review, as you mentioned.
We do have a few questions for the panelists. I would like to address the very first question to Dr. Afshan. And the question is, education provision is very expensive. How can government support refugees, as already some are not able to finance for the nationals? What are the best strategies for resource mobilization? Over to you, Dr. Afshan.
Thank you very much for this important question. I think when we look at how best to make sure children are in school, including refugee children in humanitarian settings, it's very important that we look at costed plans. And that's why when I spoke, I gave the evidence of Uganda's model, because it's very clear that if we're able to look at costed plans that know how many children are in country, what are the age cohorts, what are the types of education needs they need, specific child-focused data and coherent measurement, we'll be able to then see how best, what are the investment plans needed. And clearly, many governments are going to need support from donors, foundations, UN agencies collaborating, and others to strengthen the capacity to invest in children. We also have examples where national resources have been dedicated to include refugee children, partly because in the longer term, we're looking at integration of those children. So I think there's a joint model that needs to look at where are the needs greatest, how are these plans included in humanitarian response plans and aggregate appeals, and education become a critical element, as other speakers have said, of survival. Because as our colleague Galiaroni from Greece pointed out, it's not just the element of learning, it's also the element of protection for these children to be able to be in an environment that is protective and learning, such as a school. But I do think a clear element is clear costing of the plans on government budgets where possible, and pushing to support greater commitments from humanitarian partners to education as a humanitarian need. Over.
Dr. Galiaroni, there are a few questions addressed to you. If there are any initiatives to include teachers from the refugee community in any of the education initiatives. Dr. Galiaroni, over to you.
Thank you. Well, it depends on the country. And there are different countries, different policies and practices when we talk about children residing in refugee accommodation centers or identification and reception centers. I can talk for Greece that we do not discriminate access to education according to the legal status of the child. And in my presentation, I saw that according to the Greek law and the new policies that were established in only 3 years ago, 2018, all refugee children within the 3 months that they arrive in Greece, they should be enrolled in formal education. So we do not have policies that are different for children residing within the camps and the children residing, let's say, in the shelters for unaccompanied minors. That is my mandate. However, there are a lot of practical problems, commute being one of them, because you can understand that when you have 600 or 700 school-age children residing in a refugee camp and you have to distribute them to 14, 15, 16 different schools, there is a huge mechanism of commute. So there are a lot of issues, but we do not exclude kids that stay in the camps. We also have non-formal education, and thanks to UNICEF, this will be harmonized and be strengthened the coming years, that provide homework support for these students. They do not replace formal education, but they provide homework support. But this is the case for Greece, taking into consideration all practical issues, funding included. This is not always the case for other European countries. There are countries that provide formal education, for example, only to asylum seekers, only to refugee students that have been registered. In Greece, by law, at a macro level, maybe we need to make the distinction. We have the macro level with the law and the legal framework. Then we have the meso level, when schools are obliged to implement the policies, the practices. There we have a lot of challenges. And then at the micro level, we have how these refugee children themselves experience the practices and the policies. 3 different levels, very distinguished, different challenges and facts. Over.
Thank you for making these distinctions. The next question really for UNESCO, for Sherazada Fidal. I think it's the general questions. The person who asked the question asked, I'd like to ask you about your experience and learnings about crucial factors which are key for refugees and migrant children and young people to grow in the respective education system. So maybe it's a chance for you to reiterate any of the crucial factors that you think can shape and influence that process of education. Sherazada?
Yes, thank you very much, Mohammed. Well, there's different factors, and colleagues have rated very rightly, like one of the factors is protection. It has to be a safe, enabling environment, first of all. Why? Because of the psychosocial, emotional that the children goes through. Like we say, it's more than learning, it's about protection. So providing safe learning environment is very important in refugee camps. And this is where inclusion starts. It starts there. And of course, one of the critical factors, it's also to provide capacity building for teachers, because being a teacher for refugee and migration also requires some specific skills, and it's also linked with soft skills.
Could you, Shahrazadi, sorry to interrupt, could you speak a little bit about those specific skills that the teacher capacity building need to have in order to handle this issue of inclusivity? Many of the speakers mentioned that, but very few of us talk about it. Go ahead.
So, like for example, Arigato is also working on learning to live together. So teachers really, in addition to teaching the curriculum, there's also about teaching how to live together, how to understand each other, how to embrace cultural diversity. And this goes through like what we call also citizenship, global citizenship education. It's really about developing the soft skills, once again, the psychosocial emotional skills for learners to be able to instill into learners inclusivity. It starts also from themselves. And we need to equip teachers with this kind of tool. And with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, we also talk that it's not only about learning to live together as individuals, it's also about learning to become, because this is why we need to develop resilience more than ever. And resilience is also something that needs to be distilled. So it's very important, to ensure that the capacity is built, and of course, if we go beyond and we look at a more macro level, to have partners working together, to also cross-fertilize and not overlapping initiatives. So, it goes more, it depends on which perspective we look at. But if we have a joint, a plan together and once again deliver as one UN, this is where we don't waste the fund that we are lacking.
Thank you.
Where we can really synergize and provide something that is more rational and meets the need of migrants and refugees children.
Thank you again. Let me move to Javid there are 2 questions, but I chose one of them, and I think it's a very challenging one to you, Javid. Maybe considering the IDP's children situation in Afghanistan, high rate of children marriage, as well as the great exposure of children to risks of abuse, exploitation, harassment, and child trafficking. How the different international NGOs in Afghanistan ensure that a child education project can respond and address some of these above risks? Do you deal with such risks? and what's the response in general? I know big question and big expectation, but we probably can benefit from an insight in how do you deal with such risk of a trauma and danger and those risks that were mentioned. Go ahead, Javid. 2 minutes, please. Javid, are you still with us?
Yes, Professor. Sorry, I was mute. It's a big question, what you mentioned, and I hope our listeners, our experience would be used by the countries have the same situation like Afghanistan. We have Syria, we have refugees in Turkey, in Jordan, and Vietnam and other countries. So related to how NGOs and partners can support children, those who are at direct risk of child early marriage and other violence, I think we have to coordinate between the different NGOs. We have in Afghanistan, we have different classes. For example, education cluster, we are coordinating many things, and we are using our experiences from different international NGOs and we are delivering, we are providing capacity building to the national NGOs, to the national partners. For example, if we have experience in one region, then we can share it with other NGOs. We have had many cases of early child marriage within the displaced youth who were in 2018 in west of the country, then we can share it. That's why we are able to share, we are able to support different partners. For example, Unicef, we have been very, we have a very close relation with each other. That's why this part of it to be extended, the experiences and lessons learned. So another thing is to somehow avoid or to support class-affected children, those who are struggling with trauma, with some other mind problems. We can provide at least with basic psychosocial support within the established cluster of education emergencies. We can consider it, we can share our resources, then we can provide capacity building directly to the teachers, and teachers can weigh and can somehow transfer the knowledge and experience to the children. These are all the things we can consider. The main thing, the main challenge is we do have short-term programming. You know, the conflict in the world is somehow, it's not going to be ended very soon. That's why Afghanistan, including Afghanistan, then we are expecting from our international community for the multiple somehow long-term funding to support these children, those who are somehow waiting for education. You know, education cannot wait. They are somehow growing up, but without education, it would be very hard for the future of this.
Thank you.
That's why our expectation is too high, and we can expect much from international communities, from other partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nahid. Maria Lucia, you were the last speaker, and you spoke about integration, and maybe integration, as the question says here, two ways. How do we ensure the integration and the engagement of the host community and community in this process? Because you know we have the refugee community, the asylee. How do you engage both ways rather than inclusivity of within that group? The floor is yours, and after that we will move to our concluding remark from our speaker.
Thank you, Mohammed. Just maybe briefly, I think, as I mentioned, that a critical aspect is that education for migrants and refugees should be part of the national education systems. So there is interaction between the local children, the migrants, and refugees. I think that's the most important. But I think when we were talking about the teacher training, I think there is an important aspect, which is the pedagogy that is needed. And our colleague from UNESCO was alluding to that. Is this transformative pedagogy that allows this interaction to happen in the classroom, and this interaction between the different groups to take place in meaningful ways, creating dialogue, creating opportunities for rediscovering one another, for respectful sharing. And that transformative pedagogy it happens in several ways, but it's a way of creating spaces that are safe for children to speak, to share with one another. It demands collaborative and participatory methodologies, so it's not lecturing children. So the vertical approaches for children, that needs to change in the classroom. It needs to be horizontal approaches where children come together, the dialogue, they learn from one another. And also, I think critical is the agency of the child, because none of this will happen by us telling us children that they have to go and respect the other. It will happen when children themselves take the initiative to work with the other, to develop develop projects together, to go out to the community, and that changes the narrative of who the other is. Very often adults will have difficulties doing that, but children, when they learn that and it becomes normal, they can transmit to the community, and they become those agents of change that can change those narratives of division in society. So I will leave it there. I was sharing a few things on the chat, but I leave it there because of the time. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maria Lucia. Dr. Rebecca Telford is the Chief of Education, UNHCR. We are ready for your closing remarks, and we have about 5 minutes, and I apologize for everyone. We're going to take 2-3 minutes beyond the designated time. Dr. Telford.
Thank you, and thanks to all the speakers. I mean, I think the speakers collectively have set out some of the challenges and also set out some of the solutions, and many of the speakers have been part of living those solutions. I think the thing that really inspires me is to hear the collective aspiration that we have for refugee and migrant children that hasn't always been guaranteed in the past, and a collective commitment to living the global compact on refugees, which has set out this global relationship and promise to work together to provide comprehensive support to displaced populations and to governments to ensure that what we do to provide access to quality education really does benefit everyone who's part of bringing that solution together. I think the speakers, the panel themselves and the conversations have really spoken to the need to work in partnership, whether that's working as one UN, working with governments, civil society, faith-based organizations, and with host communities and refugees themselves. Coming together is the only way that we're going to be able to match the pace and scale of the challenge. I was also very inspired to hear people talking about leveraging the assets that refugees come with. I think Javed was talking about it, really recognizing that everyone has a contribution. Refugees aren't just a burden that we collectively have to bear, but actually they're people who will contribute to the future and to their own solutions. So we heard a lot about the challenges. I think the pace at which we need to respond is the thing that I always remember, and the time frame in which we need to commit. So Javed had talked about life-saving contributions of education within 3 to 6 months. But I think we also recognise that the average length of displacement is between 10 and 15 years. And looking at sources of financing outside of the humanitarian sector, recognising the need for system strengthening is really crucial. We also talked a lot about not just aiming to give the basics, looking at social and emotional learning, MHPSS, looking at creativity and conflict resolution are also critical, as well as foundational skills. In my career working with refugees, I always find people are preparing for 2 imagined futures. You know, one where they stay and they contribute to the host community, one where they return home. And actually what we see within cycles of displacement is sometimes a third, where they just keep moving. Giving the kind of education that can really build something for refugees themselves that they take with them and where they contribute to their communities, regardless of that future, is crucial. There's been a discussion around, you know, some of the challenges on resistance from communities and sometimes from refugees themselves. And I think one of the things that we have really looked at and under the Global Compact is around the use of the host country curriculum, the use of accreditation, making sure that education is certified. And that's not to put aside options around non-formal education and the need for increased flexibility, but it's looking at what refugee children can take with them and their pathways into those different futures. As Fadi Yarak said, it's also crucial that we look at ways not just to have that certification, but also to recognise and represent the cultural backgrounds of refugees, to have that as part of the education and bring in parents and teachers and children to build up those processes themselves in a way that feels appropriate and which they respond to. And finally, the challenges with teachers, lack of teachers, and sometimes their lack of training. I mean, UNHCR works with a lot of refugee teachers and planning for the long term. Some of the pieces like the costed plans that Afshan Khan spoke to, they also need to take into account what does that governance shift look like? When we're budgeting for teachers, it's one thing, but can we budget in a way which is about training and supporting refugee teachers to come into that system? A lot of these issues impact on all displaced children, whether IDPs or refugees. I mean, refugees themselves do have very often a different kind of legal framework within which they live, and it's helpful, I think, for the international community to recognise whether the situations aren't the same. But it's also critical that we keep in mind host communities and their needs, especially recognising that refugees are 85% of refugees are hosted in lower and middle income countries. So I think there's lots of solutions that came out, looking at flexible systems, which I think we all learned more about during COVID, to ICT, and to kind of creating more appropriate pedagogies, and to supporting particularly that range of teachers, caregivers, parents, and communities. But doing that requires greater commitments from all partners. I mean, post-COVID, you know, I think we've always seen challenges with resource mobilization, and post-COVID, that's likely to increase. I think despite some of the additional funding needs and the crucial aspects of education, 2/3 of lower and middle income countries have cut their public education spend during COVID, which is understandable. But then as the international community and as an array of partners, we have to be able to look that problem in the eye, and see where we can come together. So I'm going to close there. I mean, I wanted to end on, I think it was Maria Lucia said, you know, the cost of inaction is huge, but the rewards of inclusion are much greater. And I think that should serve as a call to action for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Telford. I think, you know, after such a rich conversation and as well as input and many points have been raised, Dr. Telford and Maria Lucia as well made a very good summary about the both practical ways forward and highlighted some of the aspects. I do not have the both the time as well as the courage now to try to bring any concluding remarks this, except to say from my perspective, there's been a good lesson, a good set of lessons there, as well as good tour of Afghanistan, Kenya, East Africa, Europe, and the Middle East as well, Lebanon certainly. So thank you all. Thanks for all the participants as well as all the speakers who contributed their time and their energy. Obviously, also thank you for all the co-sponsor and for Arigato to pull this together and have a good remaining of the day. And I am sure there will be some publication out of this in the upcoming newsletter or a special publication, so people can see the presentation as well as their own input. Thank you all, and have a wonderful and safe and healthy day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
Everyone. Thank you to all the participants. Dr. Yarak, Afshan, thank you so much. Becky, thank you. Javed, Kelly, thank you so much. And Chehere, thank you so much. And Mohammed for supporting us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.